So by way of background, Dr. Peter Dudley, Peter and I read for our PhDs in parallel at the University of Hull at some point in the last decade of the previous century. Peter's a theoretician who tries to do some practice, and I'm a practitioner who tries to do some theory, and somewhere in the middle of it all, some various wonderful things have happened over the last 30 years, and some less wonderful things, but that's life, isn't it? Peter's an independent consultant. I think he's working on something that I'm not allowed to tell you about because he'll have to kill me. That's sort of paying his mortgage at the moment. So Peter, I'm going to put your slides up when I can find them. There they are, and I'm going to start sharing them. And at the point where I've shared them, people, if you have questions that you would like to ask, please put them in the chat session so we can capture them and make sure that we get them asked at the end, everybody. And I will sort of do some emceeing of those questions at that point. So now, without further ado, Dr. Peter Dudley, I'm going to start sharing my screen, and I'm going to share the right screen. It's that one, and that's me gone. Peter.
Yeah, that's the wrong slide. Go to the beginning.
That beginning?
Yeah. I'm not sure that's the presentation I sent you, to be perfectly honest. Well, I am sure, but I'm not going to admit to it. Right. The trialogue actually comes out of some of the work John and I did together a long time ago, like you said, when we had to dodge dinosaurs to get to the Students' Union. So what I'm going to do is sort of go through this and end with a question rather than a statement, because I can. Right, John, next slide. Thank you. And I'm going to do this bit first because there's got to be somebody out there that's pedantic enough to have a whack. Okay. I sort of start from the view that we couldn't be systems theorists or cybernetics theorists unless we believed that what we believed was useful. And therefore that we could somehow make sense of the world by viewing it as if it's comprised of complex adaptive wholes. And we're all grown up enough to know that that isn't a statement of fact, that's just a statement of the way we look at the world. So when I get lazy later on and don't cover my back in terms of the words I'm using, please remember that I started by saying it. Next slide, John. Okay, so this thing, the trialogue, began somewhere way back in the days of my doctoral research when I was thinking about identity, to be perfectly honest. And because I was based in Holland, because they're critical theorists, there were all sorts of questions being asked about the unitariness of cybernetic control. Little later, John and I got involved in some guys that owned a consulting company and were having trouble organizing their developmental process. And we sort of worked it up into this idea that they were able to use as a consulting tool and help them to think about the way they drove their business and their clients' businesses forward. Over the years, assorted people have rung up and said, please, may we use this? And I said, yes. So there's some stuff around this floating around different parts of the world. And my argument is that it allows for the discussion around the identity of the organization within the organization itself in a way that few, if any, of the other cybernetic models actually do. They tend, like 5 or like Ashby's essential variables, to put them above and beyond discussion. And therefore it poses some relatively interesting questions about, I'm going to call it proto-purposeful activity, the activity that we undertake before we get to the point where we've got the purposeful activity to get cybernetic about. Next slide, John. So it's my interpretation of the 3-4-5 homeostat. The 3-4-5 homeostat derives, as Stafford quite clearly said, from Ashby's ultra-stable system, or shared characteristics with Ashby's ultra-stable system. And therefore, next slide, John. It shares these characteristics with Stafford's model. Next slide, John. the functional elements are linguistically at least similar. Identity is 5, or the essential variables. Managing the present is 3, or Ashby's reacting system. And creating the future is B as 4, or Ashby's second feedback. Because this was put in an organizational context, and certainly in an organizational consultancy context, it needed a form of language that allowed these guys to be able to talk positively about development to their clients and therefore convince them to take money off them. Next slide, John. But it's the 4th bit, hence the Trinity in 4 parts, that demonstrates that it's been included. Identity has been included, that problematizes it. And there are a number of difficult questions here, but we'll see where they are later on. Next slide, John. And the thing is, it sort of turns back on the critical theorists who would claim that identity is already there. Whenever we get to a cybernetic system, identity, the purpose, is already existent, not open to discussion, and therefore potentially at least what they call in a very pejorative sense, systematizing. It takes control and sets the conditions for any sort of conversation before anybody that's involved in the conversation can get to it. Next slide, John. Where I started from with this, rightly or wrongly, was that viewed in the sense that identity was internal, it was a set of potentials. If you think of it in that way, then what happens is that once you decide where you're going, you create a special case of multiple possible systems. Other challenge I had was possibly in a Freudian sense, there's the ability for identity to be Freud's id and managing the present to be or run the same trick as the ego, which is, it's very similar to Stafford saying that sometimes 5 collapses into 3. I wonder about that sometimes. Next slide, John. So here's where we get to the point of this and where we can have a bit of fun, because it's not just me that's going to work. Next slide, John. Here's the question. That's 2 slides, John. You've just defeated my big reveal. Thank you. Can this, next slide, John, be purposeful in the same way as this? Next slide, John. Back one, John. No, not 2, John. That's it. How do we get there? And it's only recently that I've started thinking about this again, so I'm quite open to you guys. Can we allow for the general internalization of identity in either a purposeful or a pre-purposeful system? Or does it bring us to a point where the system necessarily shakes itself to bits because it can't make its mind up what to do? Right, next slide, John. There you go, guys. Anybody?
At which point, has everybody memorized the question?
Not very well.
Oh dear. Go back 1 slide, John. If I create my trialogue and dump it in the lower part of a viable system, is it possible for that to act purposefully in the same way as Stafford's viable system, where identity is largely fixed and certainly outside the dynamic of internal discussion?
So can I ask a question then to stimulate other people in the room while their brains get their minds around that? Because I'm conscious that not everybody in the room is an experienced cybernetician, or indeed necessarily a systems thinker. There's even an accountant out there somewhere. Hi, Jonathan. What do you mean by purposeful? What do you mean by critical theorist. There's two to get you warmed up.
Me or everybody?
Nobody knows what it means, really.
But you're asking me.
Oh, yes, I'm asking you.
Right, fair enough. Purpose is what you want. End of. What you want in the most general sense. I'm not going to tie it down to anyone, and I'm not going to get drawn into a corner where somebody can pull the same trick that I usually do. So there's one. Purpose is what you want. And critical thinkers are people that will attempt to ensure that certainly that people are free to make their own decisions without their conversations being distorted by a pre-existing view of what the truth is, generally. And they can be French, as in the Derridian deconstruction type approach, or they can just be argumentative. And I'm quite happy to take that either way. This is more of an exploration for me than it is a rant, which makes a change.
Okay, so I'm going to have to unshare my screen, I think.
Can we ask another question?
Fire away.
Peter, I kind of figure I know a bit about VSM, and it's not clear to me precisely what the distinction is that you are making, other than a visual rearrangement. So what is the distinction you're making in the relationship of
go on.
Of identity? Sorry, I was just muting a couple of people here.
Okay.
The relationship, I think it's the relationship of identity on the one hand, and 5 as identity on the other hand to the rest. What is the distinction? Can you just clarify what you have in mind there for us?
Okay. I think that there are a lot of cases where it would be reasonable to assert that identity is an emergent property, and therefore driven by the conversation between 4 and 5, present and future, identity and currently available structural resources. I think that most of the cybernetic models tend to put identity outside that possibility. Certainly the social ones, we tend to say we're going to do that and then organize to do it. And I'm just wondering whether or not that's meaningful, worthwhile, useful. So
emergent means it's like a ball that pops out at the top of the ocean from the hidden depths, or you have some other technical meaning, because emergent means so many different things to different people.
Yeah, when I look at this, I've always been troubled by the idea of, well, not troubled, but exercised, shall we say. It's the origin of life stuff in a very rough. And again, remember what I said at the beginning. I think that there's an extent, there's a point at which if you take a lot of stuff that can interact and put it in an environment where it does interact, if it becomes alive, it takes on an identity that works roughly in the same way as autopoiesis. The 5 in the vital system model, the essential variables in Ashby's model, sustain themselves. They don't have a point, although they must have a point of creation. It's not part of the story. You know, Maturana and Varela have this, or in and cognition, that there's a part in there that says there's no process to autopoiesis. Something either is or isn't. It's a big bang kind of event. And I'm wondering if in some way that there's a way to explore that. I think the difference is identity, the way I see it, allows for a time where there are at least possibly many identities, and therefore carrying that, moving through the special case to where identity becomes 5 and then acts so as to sustain itself, which is the post-autopoietic moment.
Peter, I'd like to quote a couple of Stafford's aphorisms, which maybe I think are appropriate here, particularly about autopoiesis. One of them, I'm sure everyone knows, is that the goal of a system is what it does.
Yep.
And the other one is the goal of a self-organizing system is to learn to be what it is.
Yep.
So there's your identity wrapped up in that second aphorism. It's an ongoing process of learning. The system learns about itself in order to be itself. So you've got the autopoietic loop in there, and that's the and using the distinction from Maturana in particular, the self-organization, the autopoietic loop has to be conserved, otherwise the system's dead. But the internal structure of the system, as it is at any one moment, can change. It changes. So this is if you like, the paradox of self-organization, which actually picked up very early on. If the system is continually changing, how can it still be the same system? So it's caught in, and Stafford in response said he was quite happy with the idea that systems are self-organizing and in some sense are the same system. And then we got Maturana basically coming up with the concept of autopoiesis, that the system is the loop, that is the organization that conserves itself. It's the organization which is conserved, not the structure. The structure may change. So, okay, you might.
Thanks, Bernard. Can I bring in, so we've got a couple of other people. David Dewhurst, you've been waving at me for a while, so do you want to ask yours? And then I'll go to some of the questions that are sitting on the sheet at the moment.
Sorry, it's a bit of a key stage one question, Peter, but by identity, we're talking about the system's view of its own identity or identities rather than our view of its identity, yeah?
Either or both. I'm not entirely sure. That's why I'm posing the question. I'm genuinely trying to figure stuff out. It's something that I've sort of, it was an off-the-cuff creation best part of 20 years ago that I've sort of half thought about and never had the opportunity to crash up against people that might be able to fight back.
I had a conversation yesterday with somebody and we agreed we didn't really need to have very clear notions of our own identity, but perhaps that's less important for people than for organisations.
Mm-hmm.
So Peter, Ben Sweeting, wherever you are, Ben, I can't see you on the screen at the moment, I know you're here, asks, is the change in the diagram adding arrowheads so the 3-4 contributes to the 5? Now, I read your PhD, so I know it's a bit more fundamental than changing the diagram around a little bit.
Yeah, the question, John, is...
Sorry, Ben, go on.
Sorry, mate. Yeah, I just wanted to, I wasn't necessarily asking about the what the whole thing was, but just to clarify the diagram. So I kind of that's how I'm interpreting these two being different. Am I sort of getting the right end of the stick here?
We're going to have to do the question again, Ben. Sorry.
Sorry, Peter.
So Ben's asking, I think, Peter, I think, and I'll interpret your diagram and you can then tell me I'm wrong, which is custom and practice over many years. I think in the middle of your 3 arrows, there's something going on that I will call conversational synthesis. There's 3 information flows about what's the future look like, what do we think our identity is, and what's currently going on. And in an untidy and messy conversation sitting in the middle of those 3 information flows, some decisions emerge about the future of the organization. So actually the arrows are bringing data from the 3 boxes into the center where a conversation is had and results are being spat back out. That's how I see it.
Okay, I mean, my original view on this, when it was just a toy for the consultants, was that John was right, that it was a conversation that somehow represented sort of organizational or that level of organizational strategy, for want of a better word. That what you were doing here was actually involved in planning how you got from where you're at to where you're going. And it may be that I've overdone the rationality of this. I'm not sure that we're ever all entirely what we think we are. Cool with that as a problem. but I don't know when there are multiple choices, whether or not that represents itself as true potentiality, or whether it's just a a sort of repertoire of alternative identities. Are we, you know, I'll take the "it's forever changing." I'll take what Stafford said, but I'm sort of resistant to the notion of viable systems theology, as you know, people will probably tell you. I'm just interested in understanding whether or not it's got any meaning. I guess now it's been around for such a long time that I've had an opportunity. John gave me an opportunity to test it.
I'd like to try to answer the question.
Can I come in here? I've got James Bryant, who's keen, he tells me, to enter the discussion and display his ignorance. So James, I can't wait, frankly.
Yeah.
Thank you. Well, my ignorance is of basically the detail around most of the stuff that you're talking about, but maybe I can shine
the club.
Shine some dark on the issue. I mean, for me, this is a kind of quantum question, because the moment you look at the identity, you fix it, i.e. it's fixed in time. It's a temporal issue. The identity is continuously changing. As soon as you fix it, you see something, but it's different when you don't look at it, because it's continuously adaptive. And when you look at the development of organizations, whilst they do develop around a purpose and become more and more focused over time with processes and systems and become more fixed, from Ashby, they also need to be far more flexible and adaptive to change in you know, what's going on around them. Otherwise they die, because their fixedness ends up with them becoming a niche, and that niche being destroyed. So they have to be adaptive. So their identity therefore needs to change. But the thing that makes an organization fixed is not the same capability that makes it able to adapt. So you've got this kind of Janus duality to an organization. So surely the answer, well, not surely, the answer from my perspective is both.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm cool with that. I'm sort of looking at it and I'm thinking, when we talk about adaptation, then, James, are we looking at the sort of the Darwinian sense that kills everything that doesn't fit, or are we looking at the learning or the cultural sense where we actively go looking for something that fits?
Okay. What, from an organizational perspective?
Well, whichever.
Or from an individual perspective?
Well, where I'm at with this, if they can be both different. Okay, so
Sure.
we're really going to have different processes for organization than we are for pond slime, for example. But if we're going to understand what, and I guess this is where my question sits. If we're going to understand this in any way, or if we're going to claim to be able to understand it, we should be able to describe it in such a way that we can say, it looks roughly like this, and these are the conditions under which it becomes an organization in the learning or the human sense, and this is when it's pond slime, other than just sticking our finger in it.
Yeah, I mean, I guess one of the sort of glib answers is all identities are systems, but sorry, all systems are adaptive, but not all. Some systems are more adaptive than others. So you've got some things which are not going to adapt because they've become terribly focused, and some things are able to adapt. So their identities will change more or less depending on the nature of the system and the complexity of the system.
We could argue that death is an adaptation. It may be undesirable, but it's nonetheless an adaptation of all living systems. So, so your failure to adapt is an adaptation in itself in that sort of kind of organisational logic. So that can be quite fun. It's an interesting conversation to have with the chief executive, James. You should try it sometime. Peter and I have both done that one.
Yes.
more than once over the years. Ed, I think Ed van der Binden, were you trying to say something a little while back?
Yeah, I did. And I'd like to try and answer the question as I understand it.
Hey!
Yeah, because what I think in Stafford's work in the VSM, there's essentially a contradiction that's on this sheet. And the contradiction is sometimes he talks about the VSM as something that arises naturally. That's the left thing. And sometimes he talks about the thing that you can sell to organizations, to customers. And that's the thing on the right. And I think if you have a group of people, whatever, and you draw a boundary around them, there will be an identity there, because there will be an us versus them. So, but that is an identity that's indeed emergent. That's something entirely different from an organization that has a purpose that people want to achieve. So in the natural sense, there's the purpose of a system is what it does. That's the natural sense. But if we look at organizations, then we have a purpose that, what is it that we want to do? I'm an owner of a company. I want to do something. That's not necessarily the thing that my company as a system is doing. So going from the natural identity to the identity I want to be is a lot of work. And that's, I think I think you have to kill things, indeed. You have to kill ideas, you have to kill things to make it, to get to the other purpose. You have to kill the identity that emerges, because that's not necessarily the identity you want. And you can't win, because the identity will always be there. It's a natural process. So I think going from left to right is introducing the purpose that we as humans bring into the picture, and that's a lot of work, and that's not a simple process. That's what you do as an entrepreneur constantly. That's the essence of trying to achieve something.
So Peter, does the identity question belong to the entity, or does it belong to the participants in the entity?
Yeah, go back a slide.
I'm trying to avoid people and organisations. Hang on.
No, it's okay. No, and another one. Yeah, and again, there you go. That's my answer to your question. So you can go forward again now. I mean, the whole point of this is organising it. I mean, I take last speaker's point that, okay, you know, if you read Stafford stuff, certainly the diagnosing type stuff, and it's clear that it's written for organisations. It's very, very clear. So what you've got is you've got the things set out in legalistic, I think I called it in the doctorate, this idea that it was written for the relationships to be quasi-contractual. They weren't intended to be naturally occurring things. They were contractual. So that sort of interpretation that you move from the emerging system, the adaptive, the evolving system, if you like, to the learning system makes perfect sense in that context. I'm still, you know, I still think, or I'm still not sure where I'm at with it. I like the idea of some sort of systemic uncertainty, some, you know, sort of our version of the Heisenberg principle makes a lot of sense. You know, it's a bagload of fun because there are always places to hide with it. But I think we should, this is the sort of stuff that wakes me up in the middle of the night, worrying about this, you know, just proves I'm at least as sad as the rest of you. So where do I go? I honestly don't know. I think the observation thing is quite interesting. I think when we do observe, if the left-hand one, the trilogic one, actually holds, we actually create a series of identity frames. So we actually, when we look at somebody, if you know, in psychotherapy or whatever you want to do, when we observe something clearly, we take with us a set of views that constrain and define the different forms of identity that we might be able to see. So I'm not sure that we're actually able to get close enough to see whether or not that's the continuous flow, or whether it is, because if it turns out to just be this big monstrous id floating around there, I don't think we ever get to the bottom of it. We only ever get the therapist's view of the content.
Peter, comment on that. I noticed that you did refer to autopoiesis.
Yeah.
I did that by making the Maturana distinction between organisation, which is the circular system which reproduces itself, and the structure at any one moment. But since then, you've been talking about organisations in the common sense of human organisations, corporate bodies and such like that.
Yeah, that too.
That is confusing for me, because if you stay with the Maturana concept of, as I said before, it's the system, the organisation of the system, its circularity, which is conserved. Now, obviously, as the structure changes, the identity it might choose to give itself as a self-image, or someone else might choose to give it as an image, is constantly changing. So the echo from that is from von Förster in his second order cybernetics, where he says, I, himself as a system, at any moment I can choose who I am. So there is an openness to identity in the sense of what the system is choosing to be at any one moment. So I'm just opening that up as a, is the concept of in what sense is the concept of identity helpful? It's something that can be changed moment to moment.
Peter.
Oh, Raoul.
Hi, I think the point that is coming to my mind is that I am missing the environment there, because the connection between for and something else is the environment.
Yeah, agree entirely, Raoul.
So the point in this thing is that identity, I can see it as an outcome of relationships. And these relationships can be the ones that are shaping the system 4 there, and the ones that are shaping and contributing to the cohesion of the system or system 3.
Yep.
And at the end of the day, you have two different situations. One is what I call the informational domain, where is basically what people think through their conversations is what the organization is all about, and they will define as the purpose. But on the other hand, there is the operational domain, which is what is the identity that is emerging from the interactions within the system and the interactions of the system with its environment. And it is in there that you can see this difference between what people think the situation is and where the situation is.
Okay, good with that, Raoul, and I'll take your point, but basically I was too lazy to draw the diagram and draw the environment in. I think you're entirely right. I think there's...
We are recording this.
It's not only that I think is the problem that you were lazy in not drawing again the diagram, is the point that I would have liked to hear more about the interaction, the relationship between the organization and its environment, and how it was shaping it as part of the debates about identity.
Yeah,
I think that's, sorry, I was just going to say, I think there's a really interesting thing here, possibly about emergence, but you see that idea of managing the present and creating the future, and then there's identity. Well, there's a lovely line, slightly going to misquote it, from T.S. Eliot in The Hollow Men. Between the conception and the deed falls the shadow. And I actually think that in many ways, right, the conception is like identity. Deed is like purpose, or conception is what you're intending to do. It's like a purpose, isn't it? But what you actually do, the deed, can be different. And your identity is in that shadow. You're constantly in that shadow.
Yeah.
And I think that's where that identity is constantly emerging. And I think that's in some ways where critical theory really comes in. I came into that via the Frankfurt School in literary criticism. So they're all Marxists. But the basic idea was to try and articulate where real identity and purpose lay. And so I think in some ways critical theory explored that power, that shadow. They explored that shadow to see what was the real purpose, what was the real identity. And so in that respect, I see critical theory mapping onto this really, really quite well.
Yeah.
I find it quite...
I hate to interfere, but I'm going to have to, because we've got a second speaker to bring on and work through. And we'll come back to this conversation, I suspect, or shades of it, in about half an hour or so, if that's okay. Because I think what Anne's going to talk about in many respects is the realization of identity by a corporate entity, and that could actually inform where we want to go with this discussion. Because I'm listening to something and I'm thinking, well, for me, there's something about who do I think I am, how well am I being who I think I am, and who else could I or should I be, as sort of representing three parts of the conversation at the top end. And I think Raoul's point about the exclusion of the environment, of course, the environment creates the conditions under which I can or cannot be whoever it is I think I want to be. So that's a fairly critical part of what we can do. So if you don't mind, people, I will stop sharing this, because that's the key thing to do. Oh gosh, I can see you all again now. That's quite horrific, isn't it? And see people are still smiling and mainly still awake, which is really encouraging. That was slightly unexpected, but very, very good. And thank you for various questions that are listed that haven't yet been answered. So we will come back to it all. So if that's okay, I'm now going to introduce Ann Mulhaney. Ann and I again have known each other for about a quarter of a century, give or take a little bit. I first met Anne, I think, when I joined what was then called the beer cell at Liverpool John Moores in the early 90s, when I was PhD studenting, and had the pleasure of supervising or part supervising her PhD, which I always describe as being in change management, and rather than anything more complicated, because people think they understand that, which clearly they don't, but at least they think they do. I believe you know how to share your screen.
I do, if you can give me permission.
And so Angus, would you give Anne permission, please, if you haven't already done so? Anne has...
you have already been made a co-host, so you should be able to do it.
You should be able to do it. And when I first met her was a lecturer at John Moores in Liverpool, teaching on the Business Information Systems degree. Subsequently left, worked as an independent consultant and lecturer. Later we recorded a prestige automotive brand, I think, for this conversation, don't we? And in recent months,
I'm sure it'll come out.
It may well pop out. In recent months has gone back on her tools as an independent consultant again. So Dr. Ann Mulhaney, the stage is yours. You've got half an hour.
Thank you. Oh, no, I can share my screen. I'm good. So, thank you. Thanks, John. Thanks for the introduction. It's quite interesting, actually, because when John asked me to be part of this and to join these conversations, it really challenged me to reflect. And I had come to the conclusion I've been a cybernetician for 25 years, which scared the life out of me. But also was really good reflections. What have I been doing for the last 25 years that gives me the ability to say I am a cybernetician or not? I am completely not, from an academic perspective, going to present anything today that will be of that sort. I'm really looking at this from a practical perspective, and a bit like Pete, I just would like your insights. Am I a cybernetician, or am I using common sense? And I think I know the answer. I just would like to share a couple of insights that allows you to get that view. So I've got a couple of really interesting case studies. As John said, my experience comes from the first. I was introduced to cybernetics as a student, at Liverpool John Moores University, which I was quite fortunate to have the pleasure of, because there's not many organisations that actually do teach undergraduates cybernetics, so I feel very privileged to have that. But I was also very privileged to be with a group of consultants who their underpinning philosophy was cybernetics. So I got to be involved in quite a few projects very early on that allowed me to test out these theories and really put things into practice. I also taught cybernetics as well for some 11 years, both to undergraduates and then later on to postgraduates, which is always great fun. And also through initially some knowledge transfer partnerships, KTPs, got to play with real organisations and test out some of these theories. And I think there was 11 organisations where we used the VSM, first of all to diagnose the organisation, and then to help shape and redesign the organisation based on where they were going. So it was a great journey to do that. Over the last 15 years, I ran my own consultancy business, but really learning organisation and helping other people to learn is really where I come from. 6 years ago, I was asked, after I was coaching one of my clients, to join the organisation where these case studies are really based. And it's almost, as soon as you go into industry, you can't talk academic, so you dispose another language. Therefore, for the last 6 years, what have I been doing? So there's a couple of case studies here, one which was very early on, and then one which is very recent that I'd just like to share with everyone. So I'm going to do a bit of storytelling and I'll get on with it. So Grow Without Growing was a project that I worked on almost 6 years ago now. And I'll explain that in a bit more detail, but it was all about building capacity in an organisational sense. And this presentation has just helped me to reflect really on that intervention and where it's led for this organisation. And then the second case study is something called LEAP, which is a leadership programme, which is quite interesting because as an organisation, we were working with people who were not in our organisation, but were in our supply chain, and how we use learning to really help them drive forward their business. So again, I'll reflect on that and then reflect on where that project is now, because it's still currently live. And then pose the question back, common sense or cybernetics, where do we get to? So Grow Without Growing. When I joined this organisation, they were going through some quite serious changes. So it's a large manufacturing organisation based in the middle of the UK. Their product portfolio was increasing by 25%, which was a massive shift for them during this period. And because of all the investment they'd made in that portfolio extension, there was very little money left for growing the business, but spending money. So they were pulling back on the purse strings. They were also going through some radical changes in their manufacturing processes and relocating part of that supply chain out into another part of the world. So they had this dilemma: how do we grow capacity from within our organisation without spending an awful lot of money? So this was the dilemma that was posed. It was part of the business strategy, and the Grow Without Growing team, as it quite nicely was known, was set up. It was a team of initially 2 people, grew to 3, in order to drive some change. So I'm going to talk you through what happened and where we ended up. So you probably won't be able to see the detail of this on the screen, but let me just navigate you through. So the approach, first of all, was really to understand that vision from the strategic perspective. What did it actually mean? Put some concepts together to develop and create the outcome that we want to achieve, and then communicate that to everybody who was going to be able to participate. Moving on from that, it was to create some conditions within the organisation by which then achieve the outcome. And as all good project management organisations do, we started with a pilot implementation, or the pilot of the launch, really, because very quickly it got legs and grew very, very quickly. And we did some initial reviews, but we actually then rolled this concept out to the whole organisation, which was quite huge feat in a very, very short period of time. But the most important aspect of all of this, and one John's touched on with my background, is really the change management piece of all of this, and making sure those conditions are really effective. So making sure backwards and forwards, upwards and downwards, that the right people know what's happening at the right time, to make sure it lands well and then is managed effectively. So what is Grow Without Growing? Well, it's a participative change initiative, as Grow Without Growing sort of suggests. How do we build capacity without employing any more people? Focusing on realising that capacity shift. But it was aimed at staff at all levels and functions within this organisation. We've already touched on purpose, but some of the deeper purposeful activities was to improve the workforce skill set and to build the culture. It was a good time for the organisation to embark on this, and that's always a good starting point when you're creating conditions by which you have a successful outcome. So who was involved? I can't underestimate the size and scale of this project. We had 75 project champions from all the 11 functions of the business, and we touched 3,500 staff plus senior managers and directors as we went through. The when just gives you a reinforcement of when this happened. So one might say, was that the right time? What was the environmental conditions at that stage? And as I've tried to hint, it was the right time for this programme. Just to give you a little bit more of a sense of the scale of it all, we devised a programme. So the programme was key, really, that engaged the workforce. So we were going to, as a project team, work with people to enable them to change and unravel the organisation conditions. Gave them a very, very simple but effective operational framework, and then work with them to embed change as we went along. We designed something which is almost like a first intervention, starting with data collection, some activity-based analysis, but really flexible analysis, where you could tailor the question so that people made sense of what was being asked of them. And that activity-based analysis gave us some hints and tips on what the unit parts of the organisation were actually working on. Were they working on purposeful activity or not? We then had numerous, I mean, if you could just imagine 11 functions. Within each function, there were between 5 and 10 individual champions. Each one of them were working with 3 or 4 teams, and each team went through an event to really look at themselves and what they were doing. So this is looking for really low-hanging fruit in project management terms. What could we change to release capacity to allow us to do something which is more purposeful and more effective? So we stopped the day job. We took each team separately out of the business to reflect. We fed back their data. or the champions did, because the champions did this as well. We supported them, but in some cases it got a legs of its own and ran on its own. We took that snapshot look, and through some very, very simple tools, looking at what can we stop, what do we continue, what do we improve, identified savings within the organisation, or identified ways to reframe what we're doing in order to release capacity. So each individual champion, supporting numerous numbers of teams, went off and identified opportunities, monitored the implementation of these opportunities, and worked with finance controllers to measure the impact. So who were the champions, and what was the makeup of these champions? Well, we put it out there as a proposal to become a champion. What kind of makeup do you need to have? Because you were going to have a really important role. So you had to want to do this. So they were very much volunteers, but also giving people opportunity. And that's one thing that often you don't get in organisations, opportunity to grow yourself, to help you grow the business, where you can then utilise that experience to enable your career to grow. And the other important aspect of all of this was the hub. So creating an environment by which the peer learning within the champion network would be able to be shared and to showcase the improvements that were being made, both within the peer network, but also back up to senior managers. So what was this organisation achieving as part of that? So what were the outcomes? As I say, I can't stress how big this project actually was. At one point, we had a control room where we had visual management, where each of those 11 functions had a visual management board, which was documenting who was involved, who was the senior sponsor, what projects were being worked on, what status they were at, what savings had been made, and then collaborating all of that into a dashboard which gave the outcomes that could be seen by management. In such a short period of time, so probably 15 months maximum, we trained and coached the champions, and we also identified 11 lead champions, and they were supporting the other champions in their function. There was a massive strength in the community, a shared community of practice. The momentum, it's almost like you started rolling a rock down a hill, and the momentum that built with this was phenomenal. We underestimated early on the impact of the change curve. We shared the change curve with the champions, and it helped them make sense of why different people were on different phases of the change curve. Therefore, they could help them through that transition. And that was really inspirational, really. We identified 7,150 weekly hours of savings, which was 191 full-time staff across the 11 functions in that rapid period of time. And that capacity was redeployed. There was a number of ways we did that. There were lots of different things. Nobody lost their job as a result of this. There were in the past a lot of overtime being claimed within the organisations, and a lot of frustrations in the dealing with today rather than planning for the future within each of the parts of the organisation. But there is a however, because all good things come to an end, or did it? Which is quite interesting, because the environment changed, the strategic focus changed, and there was a drive towards efficiency rather than the focus that we had originally intended. Due to financial pressures, this happened. However, this led to a new entity, an efficiency programme, which very quickly gained momentum. The model was quite effective, and it continued, and the efficiency programme the challenge, the target was to save the organisation £170 million, which we realised in 9 months. So there must have been something in how we made that happen. Different levels of projects, we moved from very in-functional projects to more cross-functional and much more diverse projects, but using the skills that the champions had built to give them much bigger projects and much more support. This was at the time when I got a new role in the organisation. So my case study too, I'm going to talk about the new role. However, what's interesting is this model still exists in the organisation. There's now something called the transformation programme. Same but different, as most of you would know. And as if many of you have worked in or know of bigger organisation, there's always a new topic. But people still talk in the organisation about grow without growing, which is quite a nice reflection to really to have. I bumped into a couple of the champions from 6 years ago, just before I left the organisation, which I left last September. And it's nice to have those stories of it's really the thing that made me as an individual. It helped me develop, it helped me make sense, it helped me get my next role. It was one of the sensible things we did in this organisation. Just some of the things people shared with me anecdotally, which is lovely to hear. I by no means claim this is all me. What's interesting is my worker who I worked with in the design of this was indeed my student from a long time ago. So I think we had the same mindset, which is quite interesting. But many of the things that we set up still exist, which I'm quite proud of. So case study 2, something completely different. Leap. I've got many slides on Leap. I'm not going to cover all of them, but Leap is, in my new role, I moved into Academy, and the Academy was the training arm of the organisation, but it was the retailer academy. So I became the operations manager for the retailer academy, and one of my roles was the activation of many of our leadership programs. And this is only one of many. So this is the strategic leadership program. We had a middle manager leadership program in different guises, and I helped shape and design many of the interventions that we established. What's quite interesting about this is the organisations that we are working with through this program are not employed by the host organisation. These are supply chain organisations in terms of they are the dealer network. They're franchised from the organisation as such. However, they're independent and often multi-franchised, therefore they're not just an outlet for our product range. So LEAP was a general manager programme. It was using very much the same principles of what we tried to achieve with the Grow Without Growing programme, in that how do you design something which created a community of practice and gave that momentum for change? But more importantly, there was a business driver for this. So even though we are one step separated from that organisation, we had a corporate driver for change, which was to grow the network. But we didn't want to grow the network by just setting up and giving new franchisees new opportunities. It was more around how do we build the capability of our network, which is a very difficult one to achieve, given you are that one step away from separation. So the programme had to be there to, it's a LEAP is therefore there to help the leaders of these organisations to understand themselves and to develop their organisation into the future. So you can sell this in. These organisations didn't pay for this as an external entity, because the group I'm going to talk to you about was pilot, and it was the first rollout. But here's what happened. We had organisations from across the globe as the pilot group, so different cultures, different languages, different things going on in their own environment. We had a very, again, I don't want you to read all of this, these are just slides I've stolen from the pack that we had. There was a very clear selection criteria. What we were trying to demonstrate with this was that we didn't want the top performers to join the programme. We wanted people in the middle quartile, in the middle band. We didn't also want the bottom quartile of retailers, the problem children. That was not what we wanted to work with. We wanted somewhere in the middle. They had to be established in their organisations. They had to be open-minded in their own personal development and that of their staff, and that it was endorsed by the region. So that was just some of the criteria. It was a very clear blended learning methodology. Again, I'm not going to go into the detail of all of this, but involved a variety of ways in which we engaged with these individuals, which included face-to-face, some learning programs which were self-directed, some masterclasses which were online, some personal coaching to help them make sense of what was happening, and so on. This is the programme. And the interesting thing of all of this is it ran between 2019 and 2020, and we know what happened in 2020. So how did that affect what we delivered? The pioneers were really receptive to this programme and really eager to want to learn, but not wet around the ears. These are business leaders who ran organisations. They had done for a number of years. Who were we to tell them what to do? So we were just really planting seeds into opportunities and insights. But what is really empowering is the peer-to-peer networking and what they can learn from each other. Not just what they can learn from looking out and looking at information, but also what they can learn. And also learn from unravelling what was going on in their own organisations, using, again, some very, very simple tools, methods, techniques in order to achieve the outcome. I'll rattle through very quickly how...
5 minutes, Anne.
5 minutes. Okay, all right. I'm going to jump. Please excuse me while I jump through some slides, because I'm going to get you to my reflection, which is this one. Where did we end up? In the beginning of, I think it was March 2020, COVID hit. So the external environment and the conditions in which we were operating had to change the dynamic of the programme. These organisations were dealing with that situation for themselves. So we took our foot off the pedal a little bit, and we respected their busyness, their urgency for dealing with the here and now. We were there gently in the background. The coaches still continued to support them with the headaches and what was going on. And we left them alone a little bit from a content perspective, but shifted to a more online model. They requested its relaunch in August and restarted the programme. From reflections on what next, was it a success story? Well, all of the delegates graduated from the programme in December. Some of the quotes, the anecdotal feedback that we got from them, it kept us open. It helped us survive. without this network, I don't know what I would have done. It's, you know, quite humbling to hear what they went through. At the moment, and this is only a sort of finger in the air, the metrics around did these 8 organisations do any better than their peers? It's being reviewed. Sense is they did. At least 5 of them have shifted into the top quartile in the ratings. But is that right? So, I mean, not all conditions are what affected this. So we're not beholden to any of it. Was the online variant successful, and can a fully online variant be successful? I think that as long as the conditions by which we share our ideas and engage with the cohort are, you can use any platform. But I think the main thing was that the trust these guys built in those early days. So I go back to my question, common sense or cybernetics? I don't think it's common sense. I think, thank you, John, for making me reflect on just 2 projects of many that I've been involved in the past number of years. I think there's a way of thinking and a way of designing that means you are always trying to look for the purposeful activity, the common ground. But you guys tell me. So from where Peter stopped was my open question. What's your thoughts on all of this? And again, I've not been able to give you all the detail, but from an overarching point of view, what's your thoughts?
So if you stop sharing your screen, Anne, thank you. Then we can. That's better. We can see what's going on. Do I see any? I mean, I've written so much down that I don't know where to start really. You used the word. Well, you used the word very early on, which I'm giving people time to think now. Because you talked about diagnosing the system very early on. That those of us who've read Stafford's work familiar with it, obviously we know exactly what you mean. But for the benefit of others, can you talk a little bit about the notion of diagnosis? Because I think it's fundamental to your solution as well.
In the context of these case studies or in general? Sorry, I didn't hear what you said there, John.
In general, I think, rather than just the specific.
Yeah. Knowing where we are now and using a framework to unpick that really, and the viable system model comes in really handy for me to do that. It's interesting you should ask me this question, because one of my co-workers within the academy has got no background in all this stuff. She hasn't even got a, she would say to you she's a very practical person, but she's not academic. And we were talking one day about ourselves as an organisation and what we do, and I stood up on a whiteboard and started to draw what was the viable systems model of who we are and what we do, without sharing with her what I was trying to achieve. And within 5 minutes she had a common understanding of making sense of something using a framework that give a purpose to what we do as an organisation. So that's what I mean by diagnosing where we are now. It gives us insights into what's missing, what we need to put into place, what's effective, what isn't. But I think it was something Raoul said earlier on, you know, understanding your environment is really critical to all of this, because your environment really affects what you do and how you do it.
Well, that's cool, because I get it, and I think one of the challenges of this sort of session with people familiar with the material and people not is getting definitions on some of those words that we use without thinking. Vanilla, where are you, Vanilla? I can't see you on my screen at the moment. Oh, there you are. You're up in the top. I can see you. So Vanilla, do you want to repeat your comment, Vanilla? Because I think it's a really useful one in this particular context. You're on mute, by the way.
Sorry, yeah. Yes, while this discussion's been going on, and many thanks to all concerned, I've been pondering what is a cybernetician. That seems to be the baseline.
A great question, yeah.
Yes. And whilst pondering, I came up with the things I've put here, that a cybernetician has an awareness of holism. I mean, this has already been mentioned, has it not? That holism is at, I think the first speaker was keen on that. And of course, tied in with that is a knowledge of systems. Once you know about holism, you're, the systems are integral, yeah. And then there was a willingness to pay attention. Every cybernetician, ladies and gentlemen, that I have ever met has been really focused and prepared to pay attention. This is not, in my world, this is not usual. So I'm very conscious of it in your world. And then, of course, being prepared to change. So taking action on a perceived issue. Pay attention and act on it. That seems to me to be inherent in the nature of cyberneticians. And then I found I had nothing else to say about cyberneticians. So I'm sure there's a great deal more. And this is just, you know, base stuff. It doesn't cover all the elegant issues that you've been talking about.
You would hear what Anne was saying, and I was listening to it, and I was hearing cybernetics as it was being described. I was seeing the structure emerge in my head, seeing the engagement. I'd see it very cybernetically. I think the one that really, for me, connected with what Peter had to say, and this might be where we start to link the two conversations, was this notion of you talked about participation and inclusion. And so I always find myself thinking, so to what extent is the participation and the inclusion the driver of the emergent identity that Peter was talking about before? So do you want to talk about why did you get that sort of participation, that sort of inclusive approach? Where did that come from?
Is that for me?
That's for you, yeah.
Where did we get that participation from? Clarity in what we were trying to achieve, and helping everybody understand where we were going. They could see what was in it for them. They could see what was in it for the organisation. And I think it's a way of selling what we're doing in a way which takes people somewhere. We didn't just do it to people, and I've been in organisations where it's been done to me. And that was one of the key things, I think, from a change management perspective, to give everyone the vision and the structure and the process and the tools, and encourage them and give them feedback and tell them how well they're doing, and be there when they fall down and learn from where they fell down and pick them back up again and push them back out and help them to be successful. And I think that's where we got participation, and then sharing how people in the peer network were able to, first of all, just share with each other what was being achieved, which is like, you know, that proud moment. I can stand there, I can say, oh, that was great, that was me. Before you then give them the opportunity to share that with the senior managers, because that's the scary thing. You can't do that at the beginning, but within their peers and getting feedback from their peers, that gave them confidence. That's how we got participation. People understood why we were doing it. They knew it was a journey. They could see it was beneficial. It gave them time back. So even the people that the champions were working with could see that they were getting a solution from what they were doing. And there were a lot of very, very simple things we did that gave people back time, control, and a sense of, oh my goodness, we can do this. We can change what we do, rather than it's the way it's always done.
So I'm looking for other hands to wake up, so I don't dominate the conversations. Angus, please come in.
Anne, thank you.
Welcome to you.
First of all, thank you very much. It was a very clear presentation, and you gave 2 case studies for the price of 1, so to speak. It was great. I'd like to ask you a question which is intended to enable you to give us some more at a particular level. So it's just a question asking you to go a bit deeper. And I would advise one case, because I think it's really difficult to go into details on two cases in this short time.
Mhm.
So if you'd like to pick one of the two,
Mhm.
and if I look at it, if I express it like this, if it's quite clear this was very successful, and in a way it's used to being described perhaps in a context and with language and so on, which is for ordinary purposes. And when you look at it, you can say, well, you know, you can see why this is successful. It's got all sorts of the ingredients that you would normally expect to have in a really well-run management change project if it's all put together in the right kind of way and run by the right kind of people with the right kind of ethos and so on. Great. What I'd like to ask you is, when you look at one of them, what would you identify as the key generative design principle or key generative design principles that enabled it to be successful? And I'd invite you not to try and give it in systems language or cybernetic language, but in the natural language of your experience. What was the key design principle or principles that you think make it so structurally effective that it could be repeated and repeated in different variations and successful?
A really good question. I think there's a number of component parts that make up the whole. If I take the first one, so grow without growing, some of the ingredients that made it successful were the organisation supported what was happening, so the sponsorship was there. There was a repeatable process as part of how it was designed. So we could lift what we were doing with one intervention with a group of people and replicate that and train people to help and support that happening. There was a lot of learning points where we had lots of reflections as we went through, realised there was ways to do things more effectively, share common themes to allow others to not learn faster by through doing that. But really the participation, the engagement was the final key ingredient in all of this. I don't think it was the individuals managing the process that was the critical part of it, but the way the process was designed. Does that answer your question?
Well, it's a wonderful answer. You would know better whether it answers my question than I do, but it answers the question in the sense that it's directed at the question. What I hear you talking about is the senior management are involved, which means that the identity management level of the organization was embedded. Effectively, they were embedded into the process, so identity starts to pervade it. And there's a feedback loop going on because obviously they're embedded. It means things are going up and down in that process, and there's a communication flow. It means that you're creating structures that are repeatable, so that's recursive structures that are happening, and you're creating thematic forms like in music, and thematic forms means that they can be repeated and repeated again, and then repeated with variation, like themes can always be repeated with variation, and that enables a variety. So there's an embedded something simplifies, the theme simplifies the pattern, but then enables variety and amplification through different variant patterns at different levels. And it could be repeated at different structures, different levels of time and over time. That's how I'm interpreting it. And that involved, you earlier on talked about the word trust. So there was a trust building process which amplifies information flow and amplifies openness and connection between things. So, you know, I find it very interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, but the other aspect of it all, just to add to what you're describing, was the feedback loops that pick things up quickly when things are not quite going to plan.
How did that work?
So there's a lot of examples of this. So as I said to you before, one of the first diagnostic elements of the program was the activity-based assessment, collecting the data. And when we rolled this out into some of the functions, the language we were using in the collecting of the data didn't quite resonate. If you can imagine, the language of a purchasing department is completely different than the language of an engineering department and the language of the HR department. So we were getting resistance to people sharing what their activity analysis was because they didn't understand the language being used. So we had to very, very quickly give the flexibility to adjust what was being asked so that it made sense to them. So that's one example of very quickly adjusting the system to meet the needs of the environment it was operating in. And there's one of many examples of that. You know, the project themselves, they went from tiny things to, you know, one of the fairly early successes was the meeting landscapes that we had within the organisation, which were, you can imagine, a corporate. They're very complex. There's lots of people in a room at the same time, wasting their time. So unpicking how that happened and giving people freedom to change what they did and give them autonomy to redesign to the most effectiveness was quite an empowering thing. Once we showcased what some of the areas had changed to other areas, that gave that opportunity to people to say, wow, they can do it differently, so we can do it differently. But with the main purpose of the outcomes of the effectiveness of the process still operate. And those feedback loops to share those ideas with people, to give people new examples was phenomenal.
You know, that's the meeting landscapes is a gorgeous concept I haven't come across, but just to help make a link back to Peter, there's two words, brand and culture. You might have a different word for culture in your organization, but they're both identity terms. And I'm wondering whether, to connect back to Peter, you might say anything about what effect this had on brand and or culture.
Is that to me or to Peter?
It's to you.
Oh,
so that
sorry.
you then, he talked about identity without these words ever appearing, and they're common business terms.
Brand identity is quite an interesting one. This organisation was 100 years old last year, so brand played an important part. It played an important part of the dialogue. That's the way we do things around here. You know, those storytelling elements where there was a lot of history around that. And they had to really shift because it was important to maintain the brand identity, but it's also important to be able to move with the times and transition whilst keeping that identity. So we're always faithful to who we are, but we can do things more effectively.
Angus, I'm going to come in here if I may, because Malcolm's been waiting to ask a question for a little while. That was really, really interesting. I've written lots of notes down on the basis of that exchange. So Malcolm, over to you.
Yeah, hi, Anne. Like you, I'm from Liverpool, but I'll come on to that in a minute because there's a specific point about this. I was actually surprised by your conclusion, which seemed a bit rushed, where you said it wasn't common sense. Now, I think there's an interesting point here. Some people here might be aware of Gramsci and the whole idea of common sense. And this, by the way, relates back to the first presentation with critical thinking to undermine common sense. But when you can actually, perhaps once you've got through what I would call organizational or business ideology, don't you think a lot of people are already primed for it?
Yeah.
I mean, just think of all the wonderful drama that came out of Liverpool in the 70s and 80s. It was really complex, from Alan Bleasdale to Willie Russell to even Brookside and even Coronation Street. People can understand grayness, uncertainty, complexity. And did you find that once you'd broken through that, you could get through to people by just even using popular culture?
Absolutely. I think you've hit the nail on the head with some people have common sense. Can it be taught? Possibly. Yeah. Is it always right? No. But learning from it is the important thing. You know, we can make decisions and we can do something and it can go right or wrong, whichever we determine wrong to be. but do we learn from it? And some people do, and some people don't. They keep hitting, you know, the same thing with the same object until nothing continues to happen. I think my common sense helped me understand cybernetics. So I think I've got a systems thinking background no matter what. Some people don't. I can give you lots of people's names who have no common sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Thank you for the question, though. It's quite interesting.
And I have a question for you. And this is a question that has its origin almost 50 years back in Chile. And in those days, I think one of the key ideas that Stafford was putting forward was the idea of indices of performance. And in particular, the notions of actuality, capability, and potentiality. And from there, we had a number of indices that were the ones that were used in the project. Now, the question is, first, do you make a distinction between capability, which is what I have just introduced, and capacity? Can you just clarify for us what is it? And perhaps we can follow from there.
That's a really interesting question. Capacity was the key because people were busy fools and doing, there was a perception that they didn't have time. And we almost had to put a mirror up to people to allow them to understand their own capacity constraints and then give them insight into, are they capable of change, and help them work through what that change might be. It wasn't based on an individual. It was a team that identified the future. But I use the term capability quite a bit with regard to the champions. These were, as I said earlier, volunteers who had never really got involved in lots of projects. There were a lot of people were been with the organisation for a long time. Some were new graduates, some were managers, some were not. And they were all completely different in terms of their capability. Not many, there were a few that had been involved in change projects at the time, but not all of them. But it was helping them learn what they could do as individuals to help the project move forward. I'm not sure I'm answering your question, Rahul.
What you put in my mind, Anne, is to what extent did, because it's something Peter and I have argued about over many years, capacity and capability. So to what extent did allowing or encouraging or enabling the individual participants in the program to realize, as in understand their own capacity and capability, enable the whole program to work? So how much of that was sort of emerging from by allowing or encouraging or enabling people to do if you like, a bigger job, to realize what they were wasting? How much of that drove the success?
I think probably 90% of what we did was just that. We didn't focus on individuals as such with regard to the change. We used the team level to identify what could be changed and how to change. And it was the power of the team that got people through. So there was never a business department which was of one person. But it was about giving people tools to really look and see, are the things you do today enabling you to achieve what you want to achieve tomorrow? And in many cases the answer was no. So we gave them very simple tools to help them to understand that, and permission to say they wanted to do things differently.
So if I was to now observe the identity of the organization, would that reflect the changed identities of the people who work in it, who have been enabled by this program? So I'm trying to make that connection between, if I'm a more capable individual, do I create a more identifiable, a more capable organization, which we can recognize at the level of the entity rather than the individual within the entity?
Yeah, I think the answer is yes. 100% across the board, no. But in many cases, it's that sort of stone rolling down the hill. Everybody benefited from the others within the equation.
So I think
let me complete the point I was making. I think in our view, capacity was very much, if I use the metaphor, or I use the example of a plant, I can talk about the capacity of a plant and perhaps the capacity of a machine. But on the other hand, when I'm interested in systemic views of the plant, I am interested to see the interactions of that machine with the others. And is the development of a systemic model of the situation that allows us to recognize that the capability is different to the capacity. I can say the capacity of this machine is 100, the capability is 80, because it is part of a larger network. And this larger network is in some constraints.
Yeah, it's an interesting point, because when we developed this program, I think I'll answer your question with an example just to help me make sense of, am I on the right lines? There was a point where there was only so much a team could change without it becoming too big for them, because they were part of a bigger system. And they were not responsible for the other part, but it affected them as either a supplier to or customer of. And that's where, as the program evolved, it needed to grow, not only within the limited constraints of the business unit or the team, but to the functions. So we had to enable that, because we did have constraints as people were identifying, but we want to change, but we can't because they don't allow us to. So that was bringing those people together to get those bigger projects looked at cross-functionally.
Point out of that, because I think your example is very good. The immediate thing is that once you start to look at constraints, didn't you find the need to model the situation using the viable system model?
I think I did subconsciously without doing it formally.
Precisely the way in which you recognize constraints is by looking at the relationships that are part of that situation. And you can see what the capabilities are as opposed to the capacity.
Thank you for letting me share that reflection. That was really insightful. I think you're right. Apologies to everybody actually for all of your questions that you were asking in the chat while I was presenting. I couldn't actually see any of them. I've just been scrolling through some of them, so thank you for those. I'm not going to answer all of them or dare to in the time we've got left, but thanks.
Well, I'm waiting. James Bryant, I think you want to come back in. Is that your
I was just going to, because I've worked in this arena. Raoul, one of the ways you might look at it is with COVIS jar, if you're aware of COVIS jar, in that you've got a jar with a particular capacity and a whole bunch of things you want to put in it, but it's only capable of holding that capacity if you put them in the right order.
I think it's more than the right order, is the right relationships, because it's not a linear type of situation. So what you expect is to see relationships that help to make better use of that resource. in the context in which it is operating. Does it help?
I'm not sure I understand what you just said, to be honest. But
you say that if you put the activities of that child in the right order, you could develop the capabilities.
No. What I'm saying is that if you take an individual, they have a capacity of time. In the context that Ann's talking about, an individual working in a business has a capacity, which is time. They have a wide capability because there are lots of different things that they can do. And if you're in an organization, you want to maximize the if I've understood what Ann was talking about correctly, you want to maximize the capacity of the business. You have to change what they're doing, so they're doing higher value activities rather than filling their time. I think Ann said they were busy idiots. Rather than filling their time up with small stuff in terms of COVID's jar, they fill their time up with big stuff and do the important things which have got more value. So they generate more value for their time.
I think James, I think you were saying, I think I understood what you were saying there. And the word you used was the right order when you were expanding the activity.
It was.
And my answer to you was, I am more interested not in the right order, but the right relationships. And the relationships are the ones that take the situation out of a linear type of situation into a systemic type of situation.
Okay.
May I say something? Something big about interactions and interdependency in what Raoul is saying, that the interactions between the things are as important, if not more important, perhaps, than the things themselves.
Not the order. The order for me is.
May I say something about competence then?
Very linear type of thing.
Who was that? Who's waving now? I can't see you.
Arend.
Go on.
Yeah, I was just reflecting on capability, capacity. And what we do is train competencies, measure and train competency first. So there's 3 levels of competency. There's awareness, knowledge, and skill. I think that must be known before you can implement any change. So this is a step earlier than the general management of change. That's my input. What do you say?
What's your industry, Arend? What's your background? Because for people who don't know you.
Well, I'm a businessman or an entrepreneur. I have my own companies, and I look at it from a CEO position rather than a cybernetician. Okay. So I look at it from a different angle, and I train people now. So I do a little bit different approach, but I use cybernetical techniques and knowledge to enhance the training in a faster way, like this.
Okay, cool. David, you were making a remark in the chat room just now, which I picked up and thought I'll make you say it out loud.
This is my generic awkward question to management consultants who I've sort of skirted around the edges of periodically. We know the research with psychotherapists who have a plethora of theories, but the actual effectiveness of psychotherapists is relatively independent of the theories which they say they are operating with. You see where I'm going. Arguably, both Peter and yourself, Anne, are extremely competent individual personal people for whom the employees can feel, I can trust this person, I can talk to them when I have something to say. There's a decent chance that A, I won't get in trouble, B, they might actually let me do it. It's very easy to, I mean, I may think I'm a wonderful altruistic person, but the way I operate may mean that my theory about myself isn't what people who observe me think. So surely you're not going to say that your own individual capacities and competences in this situation aren't more important than the theoretical structure that you've given us, or do they not do they join together somehow?
That's a really interesting observation. I think you're right.
Oh no.
But who am I to say?
Please disagree
I'm
with
not
me.
good.
John Morgan, do you want to come in and answer that?
I'm not sure I can help. I have
You
a
appear to
personal
be waving,
preference.
that's why I called on you.
Sorry, now I was waving elsewhere. I think what's going on here is a discussion of priority rather than of understanding.
Okay, that was short and to the point.
Can I make a comment? I think something that's often overlooked in all sorts of systems thinking is the power of rhetoric, Aristotelian rhetoric. And some people do say he was the original systems thinker. But the three components of Aristotelian rhetoric are ethos, logos, and pathos. Now, ethos is the trust in the speaker or the credibility of the speaker. I mean, logos is the appeal to reason, and I think Ann's presentation focused on the logos, I think. But the pathos is also about the emotions, how you play with the emotions, and I think that's what I was getting at with my earlier question. How do you actually just tap into people's emotions who might just be watching Coronation Street, but actually understanding complexity and ambiguity? But I think this that particular question about trust, and I think Angus put something in the chat earlier, a very profound comment, I think, is how trust can amplify variety. I want to unpack that in my own mind, but I think for the moment, ethos, this idea of an appeal to credibility, really has to be somehow united with systems thinking. Because let's look at another way. If I talk about cybernetics to my mates in the pub, they're either going to turn off or I'm just going to sound clever and I'll enjoy it. But if I talk about drama and if I actually talk about complexity, about The Wire or Mad Men or things like that, they really get it. And anyway, I've lost the train of my thoughts, but that's what I'm getting at.
Thanks, Malcolm. I want to bring in Jonathan Randall, recently accused of being an accountant.
I'm recovering though. Yeah, I was just going to say I've worked with quite a number of the large consultancies, and from that experience and from the little knowledge I have of cybernetics, I think their performance could be improved by adopting frameworks, because what you tend to get is you get a consultant applying the particular experience that they have to your situation. If they use frameworks more, I think it would give each of them a framework to contextualize their knowledge, but also to share their knowledge. Because again, the sharing of knowledge because they're all so busy all the time, you don't get the proper pooling of the knowledge that actually exists within the consultancies.
Thanks, Jonathan. That's really interesting, because what we had when we started was Peter talking about something which certainly to the casual observer would be seen as sort of deeply theoretical and probably quite obtuse, as is Peter's way. And again, if you get it, you get it. And if you don't get it, you're probably no wiser now than you were when we started. On the other hand, we've got Ann's very, very sort of practical, applied stuff. For those of us who do understand the theory, the theoretical framework is very, very present in the applied work, which I find really spectacular. And I sort of wrote down cybernetics is common sense, which may or may not fly with everybody. What I'm trying to get to now in our last sort of 10 minutes is what are the crossovers between the two very different sets of ideas that we've been sharing. We've talked a little bit about identity as we've gone through, particularly Ann's presentation tried to link that back. Where does it fit with the initial discussion with Peter? What's anybody's view on that? Are they so completely separate there's nothing between them, or are they actually resting on the same stuff? Malcolm, you just turned your microphone back on, I think.
Oh, yes.
Was that deliberate?
No, I had a thought bubbling up, but you got me too quick. I do think it's this idea of identity. I think there's something for me really profound in identity. And I actually think, mainly in the chat, it's this idea that it's a deeply contested and problematic concept. But I think that is the whole point, because we are a deeply problematic and contested species. And I think, I mean, in the Cynefin framework, or the word Cynefin, was it the place of multiple belongings? I think we exist in lots of different spaces, lots of different environments. So I don't think there's a simple identity, a clear identity. I think that personally is nonsense. And so it's this kind of like shadow space that I think both presentations have touched upon.
Mm-hmm.
Having spent 20 years working on identity and the last 10 years working on a book called, currently titled Identity, the Book, I'm very interested in all of this.
You have a definitive answer, Angus?
Well, I have quite a lot of answers to it, but obviously not in 2 minutes, and I'm not trying to give an answer now. What I'd like to do rather is say, what I found interesting is that, and I'm wondering whether this would be generative for the conversation, Ann's talking about, in my book on identity, identity in action. This is a whole process in which, if, as she said herself, if it wasn't functioning in the way that was consistent or coherent with the functioning identity that permeates the company, it wouldn't have worked. And therefore, it led to the generation of the full potential of that company. In the other case, we have a picture that says, here's a theoretical model, let's say, and in this theoretical model, there's a structure of identity that has to be functioning through the business. Does that make any kind of sense as a useful prop for a conversation that links the two?
Quick answer, yes, but I'm not sure what else to say.
So Angus, does the pictorial representation that Peter posed as sort of two choices, does that actually get in the way of the understanding that you're trying to articulate?
Not particularly. I mean, I produced a very similar picture years ago, and I think that the basic concept there that says, you know, you're managing the future and you're managing the now, which also involves making use of the past, all the stuff that you've developed in terms of capabilities and everything else. And you've got to interface both of those with each other. Identity, the future has got to be managed in relation to identity. The present has got to be managed in relation to identity, and both of them shift with identity. And it's recursive. So identity operates every single level, in the work that I've done, every single activity, every single micro situation of the organization has an identity component to it. It's got a competence component. It's got a purposeful component. It's got different aspects. And if you use the concept of a situation to understand the various aspected ways in which the identity functions. So what the VSM model that Peter was showing was a kind of macro model for looking at the organization, but as Stafford put it, I don't think Stafford handled identity very well at all. He kind of ignored it. There's this thing called identity, its policies and so on. And he did not, in my opinion, comprehend what identity really is well. And so that Peter works on that is spot on. But what he did say, and he's right, I believe, is that that permeates recursively at all levels of detail. So every single person becomes a system one in their own particular micro path within the organization. Every team becomes a kind of system one within the organization, and or they become a system 5, or they become a system 4, or whatever, depending on their role. And so it's at all levels of detail that you've got this repetition of this macro structure, this thematic structure that works through the company, and it's flowing through time all of the time in feedback loops in which everything that's happening is responding to the environment. And the type of response that it makes is dependent on the existing identity that's functioning, and the process of doing it generates new situations and therefore the developing identity and potential of the organization in a context. And that's my stop.
At what level? So you talked about whose identity. This is the question I was trying to get to with Anne. So is the identity, you're talking about the identity of the organization as a whole, the identity of the individuals, and do they have to be completely aligned?
So it's a really interesting question. What I would say is that the individual always has their own identity. You have your identity, I have my identity, and I act in order to cancel out anything that conflicts with what I want to do. In a functioning organization, what I want to do becomes coherent with what the organization requires in that situation. And so what you've got to do is bring about leadership is about structuring an organization, and identity is about bringing about a situation in which people pick up what is to be required and make it their own. Sorry to talk over someone else. I was just answering your question.
No, I think that was a good answer, but a couple of points. I mean, I think identity is really intriguing. I mean, there's the famous Shakespeare quote, isn't it? All the world's a stage, which goes, I haven't got it in front of me, but all the world's a stage and everyone plays lots of different roles. And this is something I really got into quite young, is the fact that I gave up any idea of an essentialist authenticity. I played lots of different roles. It's again that Kuhnevin idea. Who am I really when I'm down at the pub? Who am I really when I'm a consultant? Who am I really when I'm actually with my family? I play lots of different roles. I don't think there's an inner identity. And I think that relates to something you first asked, John, and it reminded me of the last session we had with this, or last but 2 sessions, when Steve Brewis was here. And he said he thinks in models. And I actually contributed then by saying, I think we all do. It's just that Steve was very aware of it. Mm-hmm. And I think it's this idea of having lots of different models we apply to different situations, which feeds back to determine our identity in that situation, which I think is similar to what Angus is saying, but Angus has done it much more deeply.
Anyway, thanks for that, Malcolm, because I think, yes, I mean, I recognise everything Angus said, and unusually for me and Angus, I wouldn't choose to dispute it with him. And that's reflected in my own work and has been for many years. What I like is the synthesis that comes from that says, the organization has an identity, but for me, it is an emergent property of the interactions for everyone in the organization. So that actually there's a dialogue between the organization and the various recursively embedded structures that Angus referred to, and those of the individuals that within it. And if you haven't got good enough alignment, it doesn't work. And as in the case Anne described, actually improving the alignment dramatically changes the results of the success of the organization. So actually working on identity rather than solving identity is probably the right thing to do, is work at it rather than pretend you've solved it. Does that give you a good chapter for the end of the book, Angus?
I agree. It's an ongoing process.
Ladies,
it's like what's the identity of a jazz band? What's the identity of John Coltrane when he does his solo?
I think
his band I mean, there's a great anecdote here. The band plan a 9-song set, and 2 minutes into the first song, Coltrane starts a solo, which he finishes 3 hours later. For me, that's suggestive.
John, I think that's a perfect example, because number one, the whole thing about all creatives, artists, painters, jazz, is that they have a definable identity. It may evolve during the course of a lifetime or years of working, but you can recognize that there is a common identity from one piece to another, from one performance to another, and they have good days and bad days and good works and not good works. Secondly, the identity, which has this central coherence, responds to different environments. Therefore, the different roles and things that are taken up are merely responses to different contextual environments, so that you never have an identity absent from some kind of activity in the world in which you are enmeshed, in which you are changing the world as the world is changing your response. And I think that I use a lot of the themes of different kind of music. Jazz bands, for example, is a brilliant one, because it involves everybody in the team in a full-on extemporizing mode. They all have to be synced in. They're all doing their own thing, and yet their own thing is part of a coherence, and it's recognizable from one day to another and 1 year to another.
Absolutely.
When one artiste goes off on his own and self-indulges for 3 hours, the identity of the band is destroyed, Malcolm, because it's no longer a band, is it?
No, but you see, my point was that the identity of each concert is different. And there's also just another anecdote. I've got a Donald Byrd album, which I played last Friday, and it's absolutely rubbish. So I was going to sell it, and I looked on Music Magpie or something, and they were going to offer it about 50p. My wife happened to look on eBay, and it's going for 240 quid. Now, it's more along the lines of the fact that I love some of Donald Byrd's funk stuff, but when he was getting into this religious music, I find it rubbish. So Donald Byrd doesn't have a jazz identity. Each album and arguably each concert reconstitutes an identity. And that for me is the emergence idea of identity.
Can I just say, it depends.
It is 7 o'clock. We have to stop. That has been really, really good. Thank you all very, very much for your great contributions. I noticed we've lost about half the audience in the last 5 minutes.
That must have been me.
So thank you, Anne, and Peter's had to go. So thank you, Anne. That was absolutely fabulous. Really, really enjoyed it and stimulated another great discussion. Angus, when are you on next? Is 2 weeks' time your next event?
Yes, fourth Tuesday of each month. So it's the 22nd, if I remember rightly.
Thank you very much. So if we can come to that, if you're free, you'll find the information on Eventbrite. And of course, we have another one of these, second Tuesday of February, and I look forward to seeing you all again.